The call came at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and Grant Calder didn't bother to lower his voice. He stood in the marble foyer of Elias Mercer's own building, the building Elias had built from nothing. The building that had his name on the glass out front, and he told the woman on the other end of the line exactly what he planned to do with her unborn child. The baby becomes leverage, Grant said, straightening his cufflink like he was discussing a quarterly report. We get the medical records altered before she delivers. By the time Mercer figures out what happened, the kid's already a legal instrument. His heir. My control. He didn't know Vivian Hale was standing 12 feet away in the dark. He didn't know she heard every word. And he didn't know that the woman he'd just condemned to run 8 months pregnant, barely able to breathe without her ribs, aching, would become the one person who could destroy everything he'd spent 15 years building. If you've ever been betrayed by someone who smiled at your dinner table, who shook your hand and called you family, this story is going to hit somewhere deep. Stay with us, because nothing about this is what it looks like. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now. And turn on notifications. We drop stories like this every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming. Smash that like button and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. Elias Mercer had a rule about coming home before midnight. He broke it maybe 4 times a year, and each time he did, he told himself he'd be better about it next week. He never was. The company had its hooks in him too deep, had them in since he was 32 years old and scraping together investor meetings in borrowed suits. And now that he was 47, and the suits were his, and the building had his name on it, the hooks had only gone deeper. So when he pushed through the front door of the house at 11:30 on that Tuesday in early November, he was not prepared for what he found. He was not prepared for his wife. Vivian was standing in the kitchen with every light off. Not sitting standing, which she hadn't been able to do comfortably for 6 weeks now, not with the weight she was carrying, and the way the baby had been pressing down on her spine. She was standing with her coat already on, the big charcoal wool one she'd bought, when she first started choking because nothing else fit, and she had a suitcase at her feet. Not their shared luggage. Her suitcase. The old brown canvas one she'd brought from her apartment before they got married, the one she'd kept in the back of the hall closet, because Elias had nicer bags, and she never needed it anymore. She was clutching the handle with both hands. She didn't turn around when he came in. She must have heard him. He hadn't been quiet, had tossed his keys on the entry table, the way he always did, but she didn't move. Just stood there with her back to him, shoulders locked, breathing in a way that told him she was working very hard to control it. Vivian. Nothing. Vivian, what is this? It wasn't a question. He didn't know how to make it one. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the suitcase and looked at the coat and looked at the rigid line of her spine, and something in his chest went very still. She turned around slowly. Her face in the low light from the hallway was pale, in a way that had nothing to do with the November cold. Her eyes were dry. That was the thing that scared him most. He'd realize later how dry her eyes were. Vivian cried at commercials. She cried at the end of books she'd already read twice. She was not a woman who withheld tears, but she wasn't crying now. If you love me, she said, don't look for me. Elias opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He stood there for 3 full seconds, he counted them later, turning the memory over and over in the weeks that followed, and when he finally found his voice, she had already picked up the suitcase. Vivian. Stop. Put that down and talk to me. Whatever this is, we can... Elias. Her voice broke on the not-sent syllable of his name. Just fractured clean through, and then she pulled it back together with visible effort, the way you'd press a crack in plaster and hope it held. Please, don't make this harder. Don't make it. He moved toward her and she stepped back. 1 step. Enough to stop him cold. You're 8 months pregnant. You're standing in a dark kitchen with a suitcase. You want to tell me how I'm the one making this hard? She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes. Something he couldn't read, and he prided himself on being able to read people. It was half of what made him good at his job. That ability to look at someone and know what they needed, what they feared, what lever to press. He could read a boardroom full of strangers in 3 minutes flat. He could not read his wife right now. I love you, she said. That's real. I need you to hold on to that. Vivian. And I need you to not follow me. She walked out of the kitchen. He followed her, Of course he followed her, all the way to the front door where she stopped with her hand on the handle, and he grabbed her arm, not rough, never rough, but firm enough that she stopped. "You're not leaving," he said. "You are 8 months pregnant, and it is almost midnight, and you are not leaving this house." She looked down at his hand on her arm. Then she looked up at his face. "I have to," she said, and something in how she said it, the flatness of it, the absence of drama, the sheer exhausted certainty made him let go. He didn't know why he let go. He'd asked himself that question for weeks. He was not a man who loosened his grip easily. He'd built an empire out of not loosening his grip. But he let go. And Vivian Hale walked out the front door, into the November dark, and didn't look back. Elias stood in his own foyer for a long time after the door clicked shut. He stood there until the cold started coming through the gap under the door, and he could hear his own heartbeat. Then he went to the security panel and pulled up the front camera feed. He watched her get into a car he didn't recognize. Not a sideshare, the plates were wrong, too clean. The kind of clean that meant someone had wiped them or sourced them specifically. He'd worked with enough investigators over the years to know what that looked like. The car pulled away. He called her phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He called again. Same thing. He sent a text. No delivery confirmation. He sent 3 more. At 2 in the morning, he was still sitting in the kitchen in his work clothes, staring at the dark where she'd been standing, and he still had no idea what had just happened. He told himself she would call by morning. She didn't call by morning. What she left behind was worse. He found it when he went into the nursery to look for. He didn't know what he was looking for. Some sign of her, some note, tucked into a drawer, some indication that the woman he'd been married to for 4 years hadn't just evaporated without reason. The nursery still smelled like fresh paint. They'd done the walls 3 weeks ago, a soft gray that Vivian had agonized over for a month, holding swatches up to the window at different times of day to see how the light hit them. He opened the top drawer of the small dresser, where she'd stacked the baby clothes washed and folded, organized by size, because that was the kind of person she was, and underneath the first layer of onesies, he found an envelope. Plain white, his name on the front in her handwriting. He stood there for a moment, with it in his hands, and he was aware that opening it would change something, would make whatever this was more real than it already was. He was a man who understood the permanence of information. Once you knew something, you couldn't unknow it. He opened the envelope. There was 1 sheet of paper inside, 1 sentence. "The baby you think is yours is the reason I had to disappear." He read it 3 times. Then he sat down on the floor of the nursery, just folded down onto the rug, the soft white rug Vivian had picked out, surrounded by the baby things she'd assembled and sorted and washed, and he sat there until the sun came up. The thing about Elias Mercer was that he was not a man given to public displays of falling apart. He'd learned early, in the kind of childhood that teaches you things you'd rather not know, that falling apart in front of people was a form of surrender, and surrender had never been available to him. His father had been a drunk with grandiose dreams and a talent for disappearing when things got hard, and Elias had decided at age 12 that he would be the opposite of his father in every measurable way. That project had taken 20 years and cost him 2 relationships before Vivian. It had made him wealthy and difficult and occasionally brilliant. It had also made him bad sometimes, at knowing the difference between protecting himself and punishing the people who tried to get close. He knew that about himself. Vivian had told him once, with the kind of gentle precision that made it impossible to be defensive, she'd said, "You hold on to things like they're going to be taken from you. Even the good things, especially the good things." And he'd wanted to argue, but he couldn't, because she was right. She was almost always right. And now she was gone, and she'd left him a note that said the baby wasn't his, and he was sitting on a nursery floor at 6 in the morning, feeling the full weight of every choice he'd ever made land on him at once. He hired Marcus Del Rey by 7 a.m. Marcus was the best private investigator in Chicago, possibly the Midwest, and he didn't advertise that fact anywhere. He didn't need to. The people who needed him found him through the kind of word of mouth that happened between men who had enough money to know that official channels were sometimes beside the point. Elias had used him twice before, both times for business matters, an employee who was leaking information to a competitor, and a partner who claimed to have less liquidity than he actually did. Marcus had resolved both situations with quiet efficiency and asked no unnecessary questions. He was the right person for this. Elias sat across from him at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the house and slid the envelope across the table. Marcus read the note without any visible reaction. He was a compact man, mid-50s, with the kind of stillness that came from years of watching people without letting them see you watching. He set the note down and folded his hands on the table. When did she leave? Last night. Sometime before midnight. You didn't follow her? She asked me not to. Marcus looked at him for a moment. And you're asking me to. I'm asking you to find her and make sure she's safe. Elias paused. The rest is, he stopped. I don't know what the rest is yet. The note. Yeah. Do you believe it? Elias thought about that. He thought about the 4 years of their marriage, about the woman who cried at books and agonized over paint swatches and had once driven 40 minutes out of her way to return a library book she'd found on the sidewalk. He thought about the last 8 months, watching her change with the pregnancy, the way she'd been different, these last couple of months quieter, more careful, watching him sometimes with an expression he hadn't been able to name. He chalked it up to the pregnancy. He'd chalked up a lot of things to the pregnancy. I don't know what I believe, he said. Marcus nodded like that was a reasonable answer, which Elias appreciated. I'll start with the car. You said the plates look clean? Too clean, okay. Marcus put the note in his breast pocket. I'll be in touch. What followed was the worst week of Elias Mercer's life, and that was a bar that required some actual height to clear, given his history. Vivian's phone was dead, not disconnected. Dead like the SIM had been removed and the device itself had gone dark. Her bank accounts, every joint account, every account he could access information about, were untouched. She hadn't taken money. She hadn't touched her credit cards. She had packed a suitcase full of clothes and gotten into a car with clean plates at midnight and disappeared so thoroughly, it was almost architectural. Someone had helped her do this. She hadn't planned this alone. She was 8 months pregnant and she had executed a disappearance that Marcus Del Rey, with all his professional capability, spent 4 days unable to unravel past a certain point. The car led to a rental. The rental led to a cash transaction at a lot outside the city, and the cash transaction led to nothing. Elias went to work. He sat in meetings and looked at spreadsheets and took calls from Grant Calder about the Henderson project and answered emails and did every functional thing a functional person was supposed to do. And the whole time there was a sound in his head like static, like the space between radio stations, and it didn't quit. On day 5, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer, he answered. Mr. Mercer. A woman's voice, low and careful. I work in records at Lakeview Medical. I need you to understand that I am taking a serious risk making this call, and I need you to not use my name. He sat up. Go ahead. Your wife's prenatal records, she said. Someone accessed them 6 weeks ago, not the OB's office. Someone external, with clearance they shouldn't have had. And what they pulled, they didn't just look. They changed things. The static in his head went very quiet. What things? Paternity documentation, she said. Lab work reference numbers. The kind of alterations that would only matter if someone was planning to make a legal case about the baby's biological origins. Elias stood up from his desk. He walked to his window and looked down at the street below and made himself breathe at a normal rate. Can you document what was changed? I made copies before they could be overwritten, she said. But I can't hand them to you directly. I need you to understand what I'm risking here. I understand, he paused. Why are you telling me? A beat of silence. Because whoever did this went through a lot of trouble to make your baby look like something it isn't. And I have a kid, and She stopped. Just find your wife, Mr. Mercer. Find her before they do. Before they do. He played that phrase back 6 times after she hung up. Before they do. He called Marcus immediately. Someone tampered with Vivian's medical records. I need to know who had access. I need to know who requested those files. Marcus was quiet for a moment. That changes things. It changes everything. Give me 48 hours. He gave him 36 before calling back. Marcus had already found something. Vivian had not just seen her regular OB in the months before she disappeared. She had driven 4 hours twice to visit a specialist in St. Louis, a maternal fetal medicine specialist. The appointments had been booked under a slightly different spelling of her name. She'd paid cash. She was hiding something about the pregnancy, Marcus said. Not from you specifically, maybe, but from someone. From whoever tampered with her records. That's my read. What was the specialist for? I'm working on that. Elias sat with this new shape of the thing. His wife hadn't just run. She'd been building something quietly. In the months before she disappeared, some kind of private preparation. Some structure she was assembling in the background while she stood in their kitchen and agonized over paint swatches and folded onesies into a dresser drawer. The woman he'd watched for months, the woman he'd been certain he understood, had been carrying something he'd never seen. That was what kept him awake. Not the betrayal he'd braced for betrayal, had half expected it in that ugly way that children of absent fathers sometimes carry that expectation into adulthood like a stone in a pocket. What kept him awake was the realization that Vivian had been scared enough to build an escape route while standing right next to him, and he'd been so deep inside his own life that he hadn't noticed. He went back to work. He sat in meetings. He took calls from Grant. Grant Calder was Elias's oldest business partner, which was different from his oldest friend, though the lines had blurred over 15 years into something that felt like friendship if you didn't press on it too hard. They'd built the company together, or something close to together. Grant had brought money and connections. Elias had brought vision and the capacity to outwork every person in every room. It had been a productive arrangement. It had made them both very wealthy. Grant called 3 times that week to check on him. He'd heard, through the circles wealthy men circulated in, that Elias was having some kind of personal difficulty. Was everything okay? Did he need anything? They should get dinner, talk things through. Elias said yes to dinner. He said he was fine. He was not fine. But he also hadn't yet understood, sitting across from Grant in a restaurant on Michigan Avenue, that the man buying him a $50 glass of bourbon was the same man who had arranged to have his wife's medical records altered. That understanding was still coming. It would come, when it did, like something structural giving way. Meanwhile, in a place Elias hadn't yet found, Vivian was preparing to have a baby in a house that wasn't hers, in a town that didn't know her name, with a midwife she'd contacted through a chain of referrals so deliberately obscured it would have impressed Marcus Del Rey. Her name there was not Vivian. She paid for everything in cash. She didn't use her phone, hadn't touched it since before she left. The phone had gone into a storm drain outside the city 2 hours after she got into that car with the clean plates. The midwife's name was Carol Brent, and she was 63 years old and had been doing this work for 31 years. And she was not the kind of woman who asked unnecessary questions. But she was also not the kind of woman who ignored what she saw. What she saw was a woman who checked every window before she sat down. A woman who flinched at cars she didn't recognize. A woman who was 8 months pregnant and clearly intelligent and clearly terrified in a way that had nothing to do with the birth. "After 2 weeks?" Carol asked. She asked the way you ask a person who might bolt if you ask the wrong way obliquely, without pressure, while her hands were busy with something else. She said, "You don't have to tell me anything. But if there's something I should know to keep you both safe, I want to know it." Vivian looked at the floor for a long moment, and then she told Carol the story. She'd found out by accident, the way you find out things that destroy your life. She'd been looking for a document in the home office, a property record, something mundane, something that had nothing to do with any of this, and she'd opened the wrong folder on Elias's shared drive. Not trying to snoop, not suspicious, just looking for a document. The files she found were not property records. They were correspondence between Grant Calder and 2 men she didn't recognize, about a series of financial transfers routed through Mercer Holdings' real estate acquisition accounts. Transfers that corresponded with dates and figures that she recognized she'd worked in financial compliance before she married Elias. Before she gave that up to run the household and manage the philanthropy work, and she recognized what she was looking at. The structure of it. The way the money moved in patterns designed to look like legitimate real estate transactions from a distance and weren't. She'd spent 3 days convincing herself she was wrong. She'd spent another week quietly, carefully, methodically documenting what she'd found. She'd copied files. She'd cross-referenced the transfer records with public regulatory filings. She'd built a picture. She'd done it all while making dinner and attending OB appointments and sleeping next to her husband every night. And it had cost her something she wouldn't be able to name, until later some layer of herself she'd spent those weeks pressing flat, holding down, so she could keep functioning. When she understood that the picture she'd built was accurate, that this was real, She had to decide what to do with it. And that was when she made her first serious mistake. She reached out to a contact from her old compliance work, someone she trusted, someone who she believed was in a position to receive the information quietly and act on it. She sent an encrypted message. She was careful, or she thought she was careful. She wasn't careful enough. Grant Calder found out she'd been looking. She didn't know how, she never found out how. But 2 days after she sent that message, she came home to find that someone had been in the house. Nothing obviously disturbed, nothing taken. But things moved in the home office, shifted by a degree or two, the careful shifts of someone who was trying to leave everything exactly as they found it and wasn't quite succeeding. She said nothing, she told no one. She started making different plans. She was 6 months pregnant. She was living in a house she shared with a man she loved, but couldn't yet be sure of, couldn't be sure what he knew, what he didn't know, what he'd do if she told him. She needed time. She needed to think clearly. And she couldn't think clearly inside that house anymore, not knowing that Grant Calder had sent someone in there. She went to see the specialist in St. Louis. Not for a standard appointment, she'd been following a thread she'd found in the financial records, a reference to a medical test, a specific genetic marker. She didn't understand why that would appear in correspondence about financial fraud. She needed someone who could explain it. What the specialist told her cracked something open in her chest that she was still, weeks later, trying to close. Carol sat across from her, listening, and didn't interrupt. When Vivian finished, she sat quietly for a moment. The condition, Carol said finally, the inherited marker. The baby has it? There's a significant chance. The test isn't certain, but Vivian stopped. The records from that test, the specialist records. Grant's people would have needed to access them to know what they were looking at. That's why they went into the medical files. If the baby's records contain documentation of the marker, and they can cross-reference it with the altered paternity documentation they put in place, they can use it as legal evidence to establish that the baby has a specific biological relationship to Elias and to certain provisions in the estate structure, and she pressed her hands flat on her knees. I'm not explaining this well. You're explaining it fine. Carol paused. What does Elias know? Nothing. Vivian's voice was very level. He doesn't know about the financial records. He doesn't know about Grant. He doesn't know about the medical records or the marker or any of it. And the note you left him was to buy time. She looked up. He'll come looking. He's already looking. I know him. He can't not look. I need him not to find me before I figure out how to tell him without... She stopped again. He built that company with Grant. 15 years. If I tell him what I found, if it's just me telling him, he might not believe me. And if Grant finds out I've told him, before I have enough to make it airtight. She didn't finish the sentence. Carol understood what the unfinished part was. Carol was quiet for a moment. You said the specialist had records. And you have copies of the financial documents. Yes. And you have the documentation of the altered medical records. Someone sent it to me. Vivian closed her eyes briefly. Someone at the hospital, I don't know who. It arrived anonymously. 3 weeks ago. So you have evidence. I have pieces. She looked out the window at the gray winter light coming through the curtains. I don't have enough to make it impossible to fight. Not yet. Carol started to say something, and then she heard the car. Not a car she recognized. Not anyone from this town. Moving too slowly down the road outside, with a particular kind of deliberate crawl that was different from someone who was lost or cautious about ice. She put her hand on Vivian's arm. Don't move, she said quietly. Vivian had already gone very still. Her hands had dropped to her belly, both of them, the instinctive gesture. She was looking at the window. How many people knew you were coming here? Carol said. Not a question. 2, Vivian said. Just 2. She paused. 3 if you count the person who sent the anonymous documentation. Outside, the car had stopped. Vivian was already pushing to her feet, moving with the careful, urgent efficiency of someone who had thought through what to do next before this moment arrived. She didn't panic. That was the thing Carol would remember most. Later, she didn't panic. She grabbed her coat from the hook and her bag from the floor by the door, and she looked at Carol with eyes that were dry and clear. Back road, Carol said, out through the kitchen. There's a path through the woods to the Harmon property. They're not home this week. There's an old truck in the barn. Keys are in the visor. Go, Carol said. She went. The truck in the Harmon barn was a 1994 Ford with a cracked passenger mirror and a heater that worked only on the driver's side, and Vivian had been sitting in it for 11 minutes before she let herself breathe at a normal rate. She'd made it through the woods without falling. That was the thing she kept coming back to 8 months pregnant, moving through frozen ground and low branches in the dark, and she hadn't fallen. She'd kept one hand on her belly the whole time and watched where she put her feet, and she hadn't fallen. She didn't know if that was luck or the particular kind of focus that arrives when your body understands the stakes before your mind catches up. The barn smelled like old oil and hay. The keys had been where Carol said. The truck had started on the second try. She didn't turn on the headlights until she was down the far side of the property and onto the county road, and even then she kept the speed down, watching the rear view every 30 seconds with a precision that was becoming reflexive. She had $73 in her coat pocket. She had the bag she'd grabbed, which had a change of clothes, the copied documents, and a prepaid phone she hadn't activated yet. She had half a tank of gas and a car that didn't belong to her, and a baby pressing down on her spine with what felt like deliberate commentary on the situation. She activated the prepaid phone at a gas station 4 miles out and called the only number she'd memorized. It rang twice. Then a woman's voice, careful and low. "You moved. They found the house," Vivian said. "I don't know how." A pause. "Are you hurt?" "No, the baby's okay. I'm in a truck I borrowed. I've got a half tank. I need somewhere I can be for at least 2 weeks. Somewhere smaller. Somewhere that doesn't come up easily." Another pause. Longer this time. Vivian could hear the woman on the other end thinking, the particular quality of silence that meant someone was running through options and discarding them in real time. "There's a place. It's not comfortable. I don't need comfortable. I'll text the address in 20 minutes. Burn the message after." "Okay." Vivian, the woman's voice changed slightly. "They moved faster than we expected. That means something changed on their end. Be careful about who you contact." "I know. I mean everyone." "Anyone." Vivian held the phone a moment after the call ended. Then she pulled out of the gas station and drove into the dark. Back in Chicago, Elias Mercer had not slept in 31 hours. He knew this because he'd been tracking it the way you track things when sleep deprivation starts messing with your ability to prioritize obsessively, precisely, as though the number itself was useful information rather than just a symptom of the larger problem. 31 hours. He'd been awake since 5 the previous morning, and it was now noon, and he was sitting in Marcus Delray's office, in a building off Wacker with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched and a folder of documents he'd already read 4 times. Marcus laid 3 photographs on the desk between them. "The car she left in," Marcus said, pointing to the first. "Registered to a shell company out of Indianapolis. Clean title, nothing unusual on the surface, but the shell traces back through 2 more layers to a property management firm that has no real business activity. It's a front. Someone set up the exit for her. Yes. Which means she had help she organized before she left." Marcus paused. "This isn't someone who panicked and ran. This was planned." Elias looked at the photographs and said nothing. "The second image," Marcus continued. "That's the specialist in St. Louis she visited twice. Dr. Anita Rowe. Maternal fetal medicine with a specific focus on inherited genetic conditions. She's well regarded, not controversial, no red flags. But she won't talk to me. I sent a contact to approach her office, and she shut it down immediately. Said patient confidentiality and showed him the door. Which means there's something to protect. Or she's been told not to talk. Those are different situations." Elias picked up the third photograph. It showed a building he didn't recognize, a mid-sized office complex in a suburb south of Chicago. "What's this?" "That's where it gets interesting." Marcus sat back. "The external access on Vivian's medical records at Lakeview. The person who went in and made the alterations, they used a credentialing code that traces back to a medical consulting firm. ClearPath Health Solutions. They do institutional consulting, insurance risk analysis, that kind of thing." He paused. "They're a subsidiary. Of what? Calder Group." The room went very quiet. Elias set the photograph down on the desk with a steadiness that cost him something. He was aware of his own hands, of the controlled flatness of how he placed the image down, and he was aware that this stillness was a thing he was performing, because the alternative was to put his fist through the window behind Marcus's head. Say that again. ClearPath Health Solutions is a subsidiary of Calder Group Holdings. It's not publicly listed anywhere obvious. It's 3 layers deep in the corporate structure. But the trail is there. I've had 2 people verify it independently. Elias stared at the photograph. 15 years. 15 years of building something with a man he'd trusted enough to put his name next to. 15 years of watching Grant Calder sit at his table, drink his bourbon, shake his hand, stand next to him at functions and smile for the photographs. The memory of Grant at dinner last week concerned, attentive. Is everything okay? Do you need anything? Came back with a clarity that made something in his stomach turn hard. The financial records Vivian found, Elias said. His voice sounded strange to him. 2 level. She found them months ago, before she disappeared. What records? He'd told Marcus about the note. He hadn't told Marcus about everything else, had been parceling the information out with the same instinct toward control that governed everything else in his life. Now that instinct felt like a mistake. He told Marcus everything. The tampered records from the hospital clerk, the shell company car, what he'd pieced together from Vivian's movements. He didn't editorialize. He laid it out in order, the way he'd lay out a deal structure, and he watched Marcus's face as each piece landed. Marcus's face was good at not showing things, which was most of what made him good at his job. But by the time Elias finished, something had moved behind his eyes. She found evidence of financial fraud inside your company, Marcus said. She documented it. She tried to pass it to a contact. And Grant found out she'd been looking. That's my read. And then someone went into her medical records. Yes. Marcus was quiet for a moment. The genetic marker, he said. The thing she went to St. Louis for. What do you know about it? Nothing concrete. Elias pressed 2 fingers against his temple. There's an inherited condition in my family. My father had it. He was never formally diagnosed because he refused to see doctors for anything. But looking back at what I know now, it fits. I had a genetic panel done 7 years ago. It flagged a carrier marker. The doctor said it was something to monitor, but not immediately significant. I disclosed it to Vivian when we were trying to conceive because the reproductive specialist said she should know. So the baby could carry it. There's a percentage chance, yes. And if the baby's medical records document the marker, it would establish biological connection to you in a way that couldn't be disputed. Which is valuable, Elias said. If you're planning to use the child as a legal instrument in a claim against my estate. Marcus looked at him steadily. You said estate, not company. Grant knows the structure of everything I own. He helped build it. Elias paused. If he can establish the baby as my biological heir through medical documentation, while simultaneously destroying Vivian's credibility with altered records that cast doubt on paternity, the child becomes a legal vehicle. An heir with a claim, managed by whoever controls the narrative around the child's origins. Controlled by Grant, or by someone Grant puts in place. He stood up from the chair and walked to the window. Chicago was gray and cold below him, the lake invisible in the November haze. She didn't leave because the baby wasn't mine. She left because she knew what Grant was planning to do with the baby. With both of us. He turned back to the room. The note was wrong. She wrote it wrong, or she wrote it to misdirect, or she stopped. She wrote it to make me angry enough to stop looking for her before I could be used as a tool against her. Marcus considered this. You're sure? I'm not sure of anything except that my wife is out there alone at 8 months pregnant in November and someone is looking for her, and I need to find her first. He walked back to the desk and picked up the photograph of the ClearPath building. What else do you need? Access to the financial records she documented. Or copies. She took them with her. Then I need to rebuild the trail independently. Which I can do, but it'll take time. How much time? A week, maybe less if I push, Elias said. He drove back to the office from Marcus's building with the radio off. He needed to think without anything filling the space, and the 40-minute drive was the only unstructured time he'd had in days. He drove through the gray afternoon and thought about Grant Calder. The thing that was hardest to sit with, harder than the fraud, harder than the medical records, harder even than the image of Vivian, standing alone in a dark kitchen with her suitcase, was the realization that he should have seen it earlier. Not the specific mechanism, not the exact shape of what Grant had built inside his company, but something. Some shift, some edge, some moment when the texture of the man had changed in a way that should have registered. He thought back over the last 2 years. He pulled at threads. There was a deal, 14 months ago, that had moved faster than it should have. Elias had flagged it internally, had raised it once with Grant, and Grant had given him an explanation that made sense at the time and made less sense now. There was a reorganization of some subsidiary structures that Elias had signed off on without reviewing closely because Grant had handled it, and he trusted Grant's attention to detail. There were 2 executive hires that had come through Grant's recommendation that Elias had rubber-stamped. Small things, each one defensible, each one individually unimportant. Stacked together in the right order, they looked like something else. He walked into the office at 2:30 and spent 4 hours pulling internal records. He told his assistant he was doing deal structure review for a transaction that didn't exist. He sat in his office with the door closed and the blinds half down and went through every document he could access without triggering any alerts, cross-referencing against the transaction timeline Marcus had given him. At 6:05, he found the first thread that led somewhere it shouldn't. At 7:15, Grant Calder knocked on his office door. Elias closed the window on his monitor before he said, "Come in." Grant looked the way Grant always looked, tailored easy, the particular brand of relaxed confidence that came from never having doubted himself in any room he'd walked into. He was 53 and looked 45, and he wore it the way he wore everything else, like it was simply his due. He had a bag from a restaurant down the street in one hand. "You haven't eaten," Grant said. "I had Danny tell me when you last took a real break." He set the bag on the edge of the desk. "She said 7 this morning. I'm fine. You look like hell." Grant settled into the chair across from the desk without being invited, the way he always did, the way that had always read as easy familiarity and now read as something else. "Still nothing from Vivian?" Elias looked at him, nothing useful. "Jesus." Grant shook his head. He did it perfectly, just the right amount of concern, the slight tightening around the eyes, the weight behind the word. If Elias hadn't spent his afternoon looking at transaction records, he might not have noticed how precise it was. "I keep thinking about her out there. It doesn't make sense." "Did you call her sister?" "Her sister hasn't heard from her." "The OB?" "She canceled her last appointment. Didn't reschedule." Grant leaned forward. "Elias, have you considered going to the police? I know you've been trying to handle this privately, but at some point, the police have limited tools for adult missing persons who left voluntarily," Elias said. He kept his voice flat, informational. "She left a note. She used her own 2 feet. Legally, there's not much they can do that I can't do faster with private resources." "Right." Grant paused. "And the investigator you hired?" "Working on some leads." Grant watched him for a moment. "What kind of leads?" "The kind I'm not ready to discuss yet." He looked at Grant directly and held it. "You know how it is. You follow one thread, and it usually leads somewhere mundane, and I don't want to waste time speculating until I have something concrete." Something crossed Grant's face, fast, clean, and then gone. "Of course," he said. "Right." They sat for another 20 minutes. Grant talked about the Henderson project, about a meeting that needed to be rescheduled, about a contractor dispute that could become an issue by end of quarter. Elias listened and responded at the appropriate intervals, and the whole time he could feel the distance between what was happening on the surface of the conversation and what was underneath it, and he had to work consciously and consistently to stay on the surface. After Grant left, Elias sat very still for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and called Marcus. "He came to see me," Elias said. "I know. I had someone watching the building." A pause. "You held it together?" "Did I have a choice?" "No." "Don't give him any indication you're looking at the financials. He'll move to clean them up." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "There's something else. One of my contacts at the Cook County DA's office," I reached out quietly, off record. "Turns out there's already an open inquiry into some of the transaction patterns I've been looking at. It's early stage, nothing formal, but someone in that office has been gathering information for months." Elias sat up. "Who? That part I don't have yet. But someone with access to your company's regulatory filings has been feeding information to that inquiry. Someone internal." He paused. "Someone who's been doing it carefully over time, building a record." Vivian, Elias thought. Not Vivian directly, but the contact she'd reached out to. Maybe that contact had passed the information along. Or maybe there was a second person inside the company who'd seen enough to start their own quiet process. How long until you have more? Elias said. Tomorrow morning, maybe. There's a name connected to the inquiry that my contact is working to get for me. Someone who's been building this case from the inside. Marcus paused. Elias, if this is already in motion at the DA level, even in an early stage, it changes your options. You don't have to do this alone. I don't care about my options, Elias said. I care about finding Vivian before Grant does. After he hung up, he sat in his empty office and thought about the last 4 years. He thought about the early months of his marriage, when he'd been trying, genuinely trying, to be the version of himself that Vivian made possible, less closed, more present, willing to let things matter in ways he'd never let things matter before. He thought about how he'd been better at it some months than others. How there were weeks when the company pulled him under completely, and Vivian would sit across the dinner table and look at him with that particular expression that was not quite sadness and not quite patience, but somewhere between the two. He hadn't been an easy man to be married to. He knew that. He'd known it at the time, even as he was failing to do much about it. He thought about what she'd carried alone for months, the financial records, the evidence, the knowledge of what Grant was, the fear of what it meant, the calculation she'd been running in the background of every ordinary day. He thought about her driving 4 hours to St. Louis alone, paying cash, giving a false name, trying to understand what Grant's people were after in her medical records. Doing all of that while visibly pregnant and sleeping next to a man she couldn't tell. The thought landed differently than he expected. He'd been carrying anger at her since she left, a hard, hot anger that he'd been using like fuel, because anger was cleaner and more functional than the alternative. But it was changing, shifting, becoming something less useful and more complicated. He was still sitting with it when his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. It was the woman from Lakeview Medical. Her voice was tighter this time, faster. I need you to know that someone has been asking questions about my access to those records, she said without preamble. At the hospital. Not administration, someone external, posing as a compliance auditor. I've been asked to come in for a review meeting tomorrow. Can you avoid it? Not without flagging that I know something's wrong. A pause. They're cleaning up. Mr. Mercer, whatever you've found, whatever you're doing with it, you need to move faster. Because they're moving faster. I understand. I made copies of everything. 3 sets. I mailed one to an address I trust. One is in a safety deposit box my sister controls. One I'm carrying. Her voice was very steady, steadier than it had any right to be. If something happens to me, the other copies exist. I need you to know that. Nothing is going to happen to you. Elias said because it was what you said, and also because he was going to make sure it was true. He can't promise that. She wasn't unkind about it. Just honest. Just find your wife. She ended the call. Elias put the phone down and looked at his hands. He thought, this is what she knew. This is the weight she was carrying. And then he thought, she was carrying it to protect me. She was protecting me from knowing, because she didn't know if knowing would make me a target or an asset, and she didn't have enough yet to be sure. He picked the phone back up and called Marcus again. We can't wait until tomorrow morning, he said. Whatever name your contact has, I need it tonight. That's not how this... Tonight, Marcus. Whatever it costs. A long pause. Give me 2 hours. He spent those 2 hours going through the rest of what he could access without triggering alerts, building the picture from his end, cross-referencing and annotating. He ordered nothing from the restaurant bag Grant had brought. He drank 3 cups of bad office coffee and felt each one land like a small mistake. At 10:17, Marcus called back. The name connected to the inquiry at the DA's office, Marcus said. The internal source who's been building a record. A pause. It's your CFO, Diane Cho. She's been in contact with the DA's office for 8 months. Providing documentation. Carefully, incrementally building a case. Elias said nothing. She apparently approached them after witnessing a specific series of transactions that she couldn't reconcile with legitimate business activity. She was methodical about it, didn't go to the SEC, didn't go to the press, went directly to the DA with a plan and a timeline. Marcus paused again. She did it without telling you, because she didn't know if she could trust me. Elias said it flatly, because it was flat. She didn't know how deep it went, whether I was involved or complicit or just blind. That's my read. He sat with that. his CFO of 6 years, who he had hired and trusted and relied on, who had sat through every quarterly meeting and strategic planning session and had been quietly building a legal case in the background for 8 months because she couldn't be sure he wasn't part of what she was documenting. He thought about how that must have felt for her. Carrying it alone, the way Vivian had carried it alone, the way apparently every person who'd seen what Grant was doing had ended up carrying it alone in separate rooms without knowing about each other. Does she know about Vivian's disappearance? Elias asked. I don't know. Possibly not in detail. I need to talk to her. Carefully, Marcus said immediately. If she doesn't know you know about her arrangement with the DA's office, you can't tip her off that you do until you know exactly where her loyalty sits. She might decide you're a liability, or she might become the most important asset I have. Yes, or that, a pause. Elias, there's one more thing. Something in Marcus's voice changed, became more careful. What? I had a contact running a check on properties in a radius around the lakeside town where we think Vivian was staying. A precaution. Seeing if any properties had been accessed or rented recently under names or credentials with any connection to ClearPath or any Calder Group subsidiary. A pause. One came up. A property 2 towns over, accessed by a numbered company with a very thin trail, but the trail has one endpoint. It goes back to a registered agent that appears in the ClearPath corporate documents. Elias was already standing. She ran. Carol helped her run. They went somewhere new, and Grant's people are looking at properties in the region. They don't have a specific address, Marcus said, but they're narrowing. Based on the pattern of the search, they have probably 48 to 72 hours before they... I need to get there first, Elias said. Elias, I need to get there first, Marcus. Whatever it takes. He was pulling his coat from the rack behind his door, phone pressed between his shoulder and his ear. I don't care about the company right now. I don't care about Grant. I don't care about the DA's office. I don't care about any of it until she's safe. Going there personally could be dangerous. If Grant's people are in the area, then they'll be dealing with me. That's not reassuring. It wasn't meant to be. He stopped with his hand on the office door. Find me a specific address. I'm driving tonight. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, with the resignation of a man who understood that certain decisions were made before they were asked, I'll call you in an hour. Elias walked out of the office. He passed Grant's darkened office without looking at it, took the elevator down to the parking structure, and got into his car. He drove north out of the city, with his headlights cutting through the November dark, and somewhere ahead of him, in a place he hadn't found yet, in a borrowed space that was getting less safe by the hour his wife was still running. He thought about her in that dark kitchen, the packed suitcase, her hands on the handle. If you love me, don't look for me. She'd known he would. She'd known it and asked anyway. He pressed the accelerator down and let the city disappear behind him. Marcus called at 11:43 with an address. It was a rental property in a town called Kellerton, 2 hours north of Chicago, small enough that it didn't appear on most mapping applications without a specific search. The property was registered to a woman named Susan Hart, which was not a name Elias recognized. But Marcus had run it, and Susan Hart had a social security number that was 11 years old, and a credit history that was thin in the specific way that meant someone had assembled it rather than lived it. A ghost name, a clean identity built for the purpose of holding a lease. That's her, Elias said. Probably, Marcus said. But Elias, the same search that found this address, found something else. A vehicle registered to ClearPath's property management arm was logged by a traffic camera on the county road outside Kellerton at 9:17 this evening. That's less than 2 hours ago. Elias was already doing the math. He was 40 minutes out. The ClearPath vehicle had a head start, but might not have the specific address yet. Might still be running the same kind of property search Marcus had run. I'm going, he said. I'll have someone meet you there. 30 minutes behind you. Tell them to hurry. He pushed the car to 85 on the empty highway and watched the dark fields on either side of the road blur into nothing. He thought about Vivian 8 months pregnant in a house with a ghost name on the lease. He thought about what it meant that someone had built that identity for her, that the network helping her was more organized than he'd understood, that there were people with specific skills involved in keeping her hidden. He didn't know if that made him feel better or worse. He got to Kellerton at 12:21. The town was 4 streets wide and mostly dark. The address Marcus had given him was a small rental house on the eastern edge, backing up to a tree line. There was a light on in one window. The borrowed truck from the Harmon property, he'd had Marcus run a check on vehicles connected to the area, and it was the only thing that fit was parked on the far side of the detached garage, half hidden. He sat in his car for 90 seconds with the engine off, watching. Nothing moved. He got out and walked to the front door and knocked. Silence for a long moment. Then a sound from inside, careful and slow, someone moving without wanting to be heard. He knocked again. Vivian. He kept his voice low but clear. It's Elias, I'm alone. Another silence longer, then the door opened. She looked at him through the gap. She had the chain still on, which meant there were maybe 4 inches of door between them, and in those 4 inches he could see that she was exhausted in a way that sleep wouldn't fix, pale in a way that scared him, and very, very pregnant. Her eyes were dry. Of course they were dry. How did you find me, she said. Marcus Del Rey. And a lot of bad nights, he held her gaze. Calder's people have a vehicle on the county road. They may have this address. We have maybe an hour, possibly less. He paused. Let me in. She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her calculating, running the same kind of assessment she'd been running for months, measuring risk against need, safety against the cost of continuing alone. He didn't push. He waited. She took the chain off. He stepped inside. The house was small and clean and impersonal, the way rental houses are when someone has been careful not to make them feel lived in. There was a bag by the couch, half-packed, and a stack of documents on the kitchen table, and the smells of something warm she'd been heating on the stove. A lamp in the corner. That was the light he'd seen from outside. She stood in the middle of the room, with her arms crossed over her belly, not defensive, protective, watching him take in the space. You read the note, she said. Yes. You know it wasn't accurate. I know that now. He looked at her directly. How long have you known about Grant? Her jaw tightened slightly. 4 months. 4 months. He said it without inflection, which was the only way he could say it, without it becoming something he couldn't take back. I didn't know how to tell you. You could have started with your mouth. In our house, where we lived together. He stopped himself. This wasn't the moment. He could feel the shape of the conversation he wanted to have, and he was choosing, consciously, to defer it. We don't have time for this right now. I need you to tell me what you have and where it is, and we need to move. She held her ground for a moment. Then she went to the kitchen table and picked up the folder. Copies of the financial transfer records, she said, handing it to him. Cross-referenced with the regulatory filings. There are 31 transactions over 18 months that I can trace through the acquisition accounts. They're not obvious on the surface, but if you know what you're looking for. I've been looking at the same accounts. He opened the folder. I found the thread this afternoon. She stopped. You found it yourself. I've been going through internal records for the last 2 days. Something moved across her face that he couldn't name. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated than relief. Then you know it's real. I knew it was real when Marcus traced the medical records breach back to ClearPath. He looked up from the folder. I know what they were planning to do with the baby. She flinched, just slightly, a small tightening around her eyes. Vivian, the genetic marker. Tell me what the specialist said. She was quiet for a moment. She sat down on the edge of the couch, because standing for extended periods had become genuinely difficult in the last 2 weeks, and she pressed her hands flat on her knees and looked at the floor. The marker is present, she said, with high probability. The testing wasn't definitive, it can't be until after birth, but the indicators are strong. She paused. I went to Dr. Rowe because I found a reference in Grant's correspondence. A specific medical terminology that I didn't understand but recognized as connected to the prenatal testing we'd done. He knew about the marker. He'd had someone pull the testing records before I even knew he was looking. How long before? 2 months before I found the financial records. She looked up. He was already building the legal architecture, before I accidentally found what he was doing. The medical piece came first, she paused. He didn't just react to me finding the evidence, Elias. I was never the primary threat to him, I was just a complication. Her voice was very flat. The plan was already in motion. Elias stood with this. The plan was already in motion. He'd been constructing the sequence with Grant as the reactive party Grant had discovered. Vivian was looking. Grant had moved to protect himself. It had felt like a confrontation with a clear origin point. But if the medical records had been accessed before Vivian found the financial documentation, then the sequence was different. Grant had been building something against him, specifically using Vivian and the baby as instruments before any of the exposure even became a factor. This was not a man protecting himself from discovery. This was a man executing a plan. What does he get? Elias said. Walk me through the endgame, if he succeeds. Vivian looked at him steadily. The company is structured with a specific succession provision. You know it, you set it up with the estate attorney 6 years ago. If you died or were incapacitated without a named active successor, operational control reverts to the board. Grant controls 3 board votes directly and 2 more through proxies. She paused. But the provision has a secondary clause. A biological heir with documented claim can petition to supersede the board reversion and assume direct interest pending court confirmation. I've never activated that clause. It requires documentation of biological paternity and a demonstrated connection to the estate structure. She looked at him, which Grant would manufacture. With altered records establishing his version of the baby's medical and legal identity, and with you either removed from the picture or discredited to the point where you couldn't effectively contest it, the baby becomes his vehicle. The heir is real. The documentation is falsified. And whoever controls the narrative around the heir controls the company. The lamp in the corner buzzed slightly. Outside, the November wind pushed against the windows. Elias looked at his wife. He'd built that company for 20 years. He'd put his name on it, had structured it, had protected it through 2 recessions and a complete market collapse, and more bad decisions and recoveries than he could count. He'd let it consume years he couldn't get back, and relationships he hadn't valued enough until they were gone. He'd done all of that to build something that was supposed to be permanent. And Grant Calder had spent 15 years sitting close enough to see every seam in the structure, and had found the one place where it could be used against him. We have to go, Vivian said quietly. She was watching his face. I know, Elias. She stood with visible effort, one hand on the arm of the couch. I need you to hear me. I know what the note looked like. I know what these months looked like from your side. I know I handled this wrong in ways I'm going to spend a long time accounting for. She met his eyes directly. But I wasn't protecting a secret. I was protecting you. And the baby. She stopped. I ran out of road. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the folder from the table and moved to the door. Get your bag. Everything that matters. Nothing that doesn't. We have maybe 40 minutes. She got her bag. They were in his car and moving within 6 minutes. He drove south on the county road, away from Kellerton, lights up, moving at a controlled speed that wouldn't draw attention. Vivian sat in the passenger seat with her bag on her lap and her eyes on the side mirror. Neither of them spoke for the first 5 minutes. Then she said, Where are we going? Chicago. He checked the rear view, empty road behind them. I need access to the financial records from inside the company. What I found today is a start, but it's not enough. With what you have and what Diane Cho has been building. She turned to look at him sharply. You know about Diane. Marcus found out tonight. He paused. She's been working with the DA's office for 8 months. Independently. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then quietly she reached out to me. Once, 3 months ago, through a channel I'd established. She knew I had documentation. She didn't know where I was, but she knew I was building something. A pause. I didn't respond. I was afraid to. I didn't know who else might be watching her. She's legitimate. Marcus verified her contact with the DA's office. It's real, it's independent, and it's more advanced than anything I could have built from scratch. He took a curve at 60. We have 3 separate data sets. Your documentation, Diane's records, and the thread I pulled tonight. Combined, they're substantial. But we need to move before Grant realizes we're converging. He felt her relax fractionally in the seat beside him. Not fully. But the particular held quality of her posture shifted, like something that had been load-bearing for months was finding tentatively something else to lean on. They were 40 minutes from the city when his phone rang. Marcus, he answered on the car speaker. Talk to me. Bad news. Marcus's voice was tight. The ClearPath vehicle on the county road, it wasn't alone. There was a second vehicle that my contact missed in the initial sweep. Smaller, different registration. It was parked 2 streets from the rental house. My person just found it when they arrived at the location. Elias gripped the wheel. What does that mean? It means they had eyes on that location, possibly for the last several hours. Which means they may have seen you arrive. A pause. Elias, I need to know, did you check for a tail when you left Kellerton? Yes. The road was clear. Are you sure? He checked the rear view again. Dark highway. One set of lights far back, moving at a normal pace. There are lights behind me, he said. Maybe a mile. They've been there for a few minutes. Don't speed up. Don't do anything that tells them you've made them. Marcus was very controlled. I'm rerouting my person to intercept. Where exactly are you on Route 45? Elias told him. Okay, there's a state police post 11 miles south of your current position. If those lights close in, go there directly. Drive into the lot and get out of the car in view of the cameras. They will not follow you into a state police lot. Vivian was very still in the passenger seat. She was watching the side mirror with her hands flat on her bag. She didn't say anything. She was doing the thing she'd been doing for months, running the calculation, measuring the options, holding herself steady inside the information. The contact at the hospital, she said suddenly. The woman who sent me the documentation. She called me, Elias said. Someone was auditing her access records. Is she okay? She was as of tonight. Vivian looked out the front window. They're not just cleaning up the evidence, she said quietly. They're removing the people who can testify to what they saw. The lights behind them had closed to half a mile. Marcus, Elias said. I see it. My person is 8 minutes out. State police post is 9 miles. Keep your speed constant. A pause. Elias, there's something else. I've been sitting on it because the timing was bad, but you need to know. Something in Marcus's voice changed. Became the particular kind of careful that meant he was about to hand over something heavy. Tell me. The contact Vivian used 3 months ago. The channel she established to communicate with Diane Cho. A pause. It was compromised. Not then recently. Someone accessed the communication record in the last 72 hours. Vivian's head turned toward the phone. Which means, Marcus continued, that someone knows about the connection between Vivian and Diane. And if they know that, they know Diane is a potential witness. And if they've been moving to neutralize witnesses. Diane, Vivian said. She's in danger. I've been trying to reach her for the last 40 minutes, Marcus said. Her cell goes to voicemail. Her home line doesn't pick up. The lights behind them were closing. 3/4 of a mile. Elias made the decision without deliberating. Get someone to Diane's house. Now. Tonight. I don't care what it costs. He pressed the accelerator. And get the DA's office on record by morning whatever contact Diane established. Whoever her person is there, they need to know the situation has accelerated. We cannot wait for a gradual build. That exposes your hand to Grant. Grant already has someone following my car on a November highway at midnight. His voice came out harder than he intended. My hand is exposed. The question now is how fast we can move before he does. Vivian was looking at the mirror. Her right hand had moved to her belly, not the anxious gesture from before, something more deliberate. Like she was drawing a line. The lights are at half a mile, she said. 8 miles to the police post, Marcus said. The car behind them sped up. Not dramatically. Not a sudden acceleration that would read as a chase. A controlled, purposeful closing of distance, the kind that said whoever was driving understood surveillance and wanted to stay close without triggering anything. Elias pushed to 75. Don't run, Marcus said immediately. Not yet. They may be running a pressure test, seeing if you know you're being followed. If you bolt, they know you know. And if I don't bolt. They stay with you into Chicago, and we find out where they go when you get somewhere public. He eased back to 68. The lights behind them maintained distance. Testing, Marcus, Vivian said. Her voice was very level. What does the communication record show? The compromised channel. What exactly was in it? A beat. Mostly operational logistics, Marcus said. Meeting potential, documentation status. But there was one exchange from Diane's side about 3 weeks ago. He paused. She mentioned a name. A person inside the DA's office who she said was the primary contact on the inquiry. Someone she'd been working with directly, who she trusted completely. Who, Vivian said. Assistant DA named Joel Ferris. A pause. I ran him tonight when I found the compromised channel. Joel Ferris has had 2 meetings with a lobbyist connected to Calder Group in the last 6 months. The meetings were off calendar, at restaurants paid in cash. My contact found them through a credit card trace on the lobbyist. The car felt very quiet. Vivian said nothing. She was looking at the road ahead with the fixed attention of someone whose mind was processing something that hurt. Elias understood it. Diane Cho had spent 8 months building a case inside the DA's office, methodically, carefully, with someone she trusted completely. And the person she trusted completely had been meeting privately with Grant Calder's lobbying arm. The case wasn't just stalled. The case was known, had been known. The information Diane had been feeding to the DA's office had been at least potentially, at least partially feeding back to Grant. For 8 months, everything they'd built. Every piece of documentation, every carefully timed disclosure, every record that Diane had handed over through proper channels to a man she thought was building the same case she was, Grant had known about it, had been tracking it, had been using the knowledge of what they had against them, adjusting his own position, reinforcing the weak points in his structure, cleaning up exactly what needed to be cleaned up. He knew, Vivian said quietly. He's known for months what we had. Everything we were building. Not everything, Elias said. He doesn't know about your documentation specifically. He knows about Diane's. He knows about whatever she disclosed. Which is enough. Her voice was stripped of something. It's enough to know where the holes are. What's inadmissible? What can be challenged? She pressed her hand harder against her belly. We've been building a case against a man who's been reading our playbook. 6 miles to the police post. The lights behind them held steady. Elias drove and thought about the shape of what they were actually facing. Not just Grant and his network and his manufactured legal architecture, but the fact that the official channel they'd been relying on, the patient, legitimate process that Marcus had been pointing toward as the right way through this, had been corrupted from inside. The DA's contact was compromised. The internal route was watched. Which left what exactly? He thought about the 3 datasets. His own thread. Vivian's documentation. Diane's records, which Grant may or may not have seen in full, and which were dangerous precisely because they were admissible, court-sourced, built through official process. He thought about Diane. Uneachable. Home line not picking up. He thought about the hospital clerk, with her 3 sets of copies and her safety deposit box. He thought about what Marcus had said. The internal route to the DA is compromised, but the inquiry itself is real. There were other people in that office. Joel Ferris was one contact. He wasn't the entire building. We don't abandon the DA's office, Elias said. We go around Ferris. We find a different contact. Someone Diane hasn't been using, someone Grant's lobbyist doesn't know about. We bring everything we have, and we bring it all at once, not incrementally. Not through a process that allows for interception. We walk in with a full package, and we force the timeline. Vivian looked at him. That's not how it works. You can't just walk into the DA's office. I can get a meeting. Not through Ferris, not through official channels. Through someone who owes me a conversation. He paused. There's a federal prosecutor I know. We've had interactions that were not comfortable for either of us, and he does not particularly like me, but he is incorruptibly straight, and he does not share information with lobbyists. He paused. His name is Patrick Sue. I've been deliberately avoiding any situation where I'd need to call in that relationship. I'm done avoiding it. How fast can you reach him? Tomorrow morning. He glanced at the rear view. The lights were still there. Steady. But first we need to get past tonight. 5 miles to the police post. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus Diane Cho located. She's okay. My person found her at her sister's house she left voluntarily, was spooked by something at her building. She has documentation with her, he read it aloud. He heard Vivian exhale slowly. Why was she spooked? Vivian said. Another text from Marcus. Someone tried to access her building after hours. Her neighbor called her. She left before whoever it was got inside. They moved on her tonight, Elias said. Because they knew we were converging, Vivian said. The compromised channel, if Grant's people have been monitoring it, they saw Marcus's contact reaching out. They knew you were looking for Diane. They moved to get to her first. She paused. We accelerated their timeline by looking. That was the thing about this that was genuinely brutal. Every move they made to protect themselves had a corresponding move on Grant's side, mirrored and anticipated. They'd been operating as though they were building toward a confrontation on their terms, and the whole time Grant had been one step ahead, not dramatically, Not in a way that announced itself, just consistently, patiently, 1 step. 4 miles. The lights behind them finally did something. They turned off. Not gradually, not easing away the headlights, simply went dark. The road behind them was suddenly empty. Like whoever had been back there had received a message or a signal so a decision had been made, and they'd pulled off without any fanfare. Elias watched the rear view for 30 seconds, nothing. "Marcus," he said, "the tail just dropped off," a pause on the line. "That's not reassuring." "I know. If they're done following you, it's because they already know where you're going." Another pause. "Elias, you're building in Chicago. You're home. They'll assume you're heading back to one of those. Do not go to either." "Where then?" "I have a space," Marcus said. "Off record, not connected to your name or mine, through any traceable document. I'll send the address. Go there tonight, a beat, both of you." Elias looked at Vivian. She was already nodding. He drove the last 4 miles to the police post at a steady 60 and then drove past it, because the lights behind him were gone and the immediate pressure had dropped, and he kept driving south through the dark with Vivian quiet beside him and Marcus's address loading on his phone. They didn't speak for a long time. Then Vivian said, "What happens if Sue won't meet with you?" "He'll meet with me." "You don't know that." "I know Patrick Sue," Elias said. "He doesn't like me, but he hates corruption more than he dislikes anything else. If I can get him in a room with what we have, he'll listen." He paused. "The problem is what we have isn't complete. It's substantial, but it's not airtight. Grant has seen most of what Diane built. He's had time to reinforce the vulnerabilities." He gripped the wheel. "We need something he doesn't know we have. Something that's outside the compromise channel. Something that proves the structure directly, not inferentially." "The hospital clerk," Vivian said. "Yes, she made 3 copies." "Yes, and her copies include the alteration records from your medical file, which Diane's case doesn't have. Which Grant's people haven't cleaned up yet, because they don't know she made copies. They think they scared her off by auditing her access." He paused. "They underestimated her." Vivian looked at him, like they underestimated me. He met her eyes briefly, then looked back at the road. "Like they underestimated you," he said. He meant it as a concession. It came out sounding, even to him, like something else. Something closer to the truth of what the last 4 months had cost him to finally understand about the woman sitting beside him. The Marcus address was 20 minutes away. The November road was empty. The baby pressed against Vivian's ribs with its particular reliable weight, and she shifted in the seat and put her head back against the headrest. And for the first time in months, she let her eyes close without listening for the sound of cars she didn't recognize. She was still calculating. He could see it even through the closed eyes, the slight movement of her jaw, the way her fingers pressed intermittently against her bag. She was running the numbers, building the sequence, finding the gaps. He thought, she's been doing this alone for 4 months, and she's still standing. He thought, Grant Calder has been reading her playbook, and she's still 1 move ahead of him. He thought, I spent 15 years trusting the wrong person, and this woman has been trying to protect me from the consequences of that, and she did it alone because she wasn't sure I deserved to know. That last thought was the hardest one. Not because it was unfair, it wasn't unfair. It was entirely reasonable, given what she'd known, and what she couldn't be sure of. But sitting with it on a dark highway at 1 a.m, driving toward a safe house he'd never used, with his wife 8 months pregnant beside him, and a compromised investigation, and a man who'd outmaneuvered them, at every turn sitting with all of that, the reasonableness of her doubt about him was its own kind of weight. He had built a life that made him genuinely hard to trust. He knew that. He was going to have to build something different. But first he had to survive the night, reach Patrick Sue by morning, and find a way to outmaneuver a man who had a 15-year head start on knowing exactly how Elias Mercer operated. He pulled into Marcus's address at 2:14 in the morning. The building was a plain 4-story walk-up on a side street with no foot traffic and a parking structure attached. Marcus had already arranged access code on the panel, a key under a specific tile in the entry, 2nd floor, end of the hall. Elias helped Vivian out of the car. She didn't take his hand, reached for the doorframe first, the familiar motion of someone who'd been managing without help for months and wasn't ready to stop entirely. He stood close but didn't push. They went upstairs. The apartment was small, clean, anonymous, 2 rooms. A couch that folded out. a narrow kitchen with basic supplies, a window facing the parking structure. Vivian sat on the couch and put her bag on the floor and looked at the wall. Elias stood in the middle of the room. After a moment, she said, "The contact I reached out to 3 months ago, when I tried to pass the financial documentation." She paused. "It wasn't random. It was someone I'd worked with. Someone I believed was independent of everything connected to Grant or your company." She looked at her hands. "I was wrong. Or I wasn't wrong about the person, but I was wrong about how secure the channel was. And when I realized I might have exposed myself, that's when I decided to disappear entirely." She paused. "I thought disappearing was safer than staying. Was it?" She looked up at him. "I don't know anymore." A pause. "Maybe staying and telling you would have been faster. But I didn't know what you knew. I didn't know if Grant had already talked to you. I didn't know how deep your trust in him went." She stopped. "I didn't know if telling you would put you in his sights or if you were already in them." The apartment was very quiet. Elias sat down in the chair across from her. "I wasn't in his sights," he said. "I was just blind." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. And the way she said it was not unkind. It was something harder than unkind, it was honest, which was worse and better simultaneously. And he held it without flinching because he owed her that much. His phone buzzed. "Marcus Sue's office opens at 8. I've already reached his assistant through a back channel. He'll see you at 8:30. Don't be late and don't soften what you're bringing." Elias read the message twice. Then he set the phone face down on the side table and looked at his wife. "Get some sleep," he said. "We have 6 hours." She looked at him with the expression he'd seen in the kitchen, the one he hadn't been able to read. He could read it now. It was someone who had been carrying the full weight of a terrible situation alone for a very long time, and had just tentatively, with enormous effort and no guarantee it was safe, put part of it down. 6 hours, she said. Yes. She reached down and took off her shoes, which was a small ordinary thing, and lay down on the couch still dressed, and pulled the blanket that was folded on the arm over herself. Elias stayed in the chair. He did not sleep. He sat in the dark of the anonymous apartment and looked at his wife breathing and thought about the morning. At 8:30, they would walk into Patrick Sue's office with everything they had, and everything they had was substantial but not complete. And the man they were building a case against had had 8 months of advance warning and a compromised inside contact, and the full architecture of 15 years of intimate knowledge of how Elias Mercer built things and where he was vulnerable. And Elias had Vivian's documentation, and Diane Cho in her sister's house with her own copies, and a hospital clerk with 3 sets of records that Grant's people hadn't found, and a federal prosecutor who hated him but hated corruption more. It was not enough. But it was what they had, and the morning was coming whether they were ready for it or not, and the only direction that remained was forward through Sue's office, through whatever Grant threw at them next. Through every consequence of the choices they'd both made, in the 4 months, they'd been on opposite sides of the same problem, without knowing it. The baby moved. Vivian shifted on the couch, and her hand found her belly in her sleep, same instinctive gesture, and she stilled again. Elias watched her breathe and waited for the morning, knowing that whatever came next, the person who had been running this race against him for 15 years had never once faced him when he had nothing left to lose. He had nothing left to lose now. That was the only advantage that mattered. Patrick Sue's office was on the 14th floor of the Dirksen Federal Building, and it looked exactly the office of a man who had spent 22 years not caring what anyone thought of his office. There were files on every flat surface. There was a whiteboard on the far wall covered in names and arrows and numbers that someone had tried to erase at some point and hadn't quite managed. The window behind his desk faced north, and the morning light came through it gray and flat and without warmth. Sue himself was 51, compact, and had the specific quality of stillness that came from having sat across from a very large number of people who were lying to him. He looked at Elias Mercer the way you look at a weather system you've been tracking, not surprised to see it arrive, not pleased about it, but professionally prepared. He looked at Vivian and his expression changed slightly. Not dramatically, just enough. "Sit down," he said. They sat. Vivian put the folder on his desk without preamble. Elias put his own documentation beside it. Marcus had arranged for a sealed drive from Diane Cho to be delivered to Sue's assistant at 8:15. They'd confirmed receipt by text on the way up in the elevator. Sue looked at the materials for a moment without touching them. Then he looked at Elias. Joel Ferris, he said, yes. You're telling me he's been compromised. I'm telling you the evidence points that way. I'm not telling you what to do with that. That's your department, literally. Elias kept his voice level. But anything that went through Ferris in the last 8 months may have been seen by the other side. Which means you need to assume the inquiry is known and act accordingly. Sue picked up Vivian's folder. He opened it and read in silence for 90 seconds. He turned a page. He went back to the previous page. He turned it again. He looked at Vivian. You compiled this while 8 months pregnant. 7 months when I started, she said. And I had help with some of the structural analysis. But yes, the alterations to your medical records. The hospital contacts documentation is in the second section. He found it. He read it. He set the folder down and picked up Elias's documents and read those too, with the same focused quiet, moving through the pages at a pace that told Elias he was reading, actually reading, not skimming. After 4 minutes, he put everything down and looked at the whiteboard on the wall for a moment. Then he said, I've had a parallel inquiry running for 6 months. Different entry point, not connected to anything Diane Cho gave Ferris. I started it because a pattern in the regulatory filings looked wrong to me, and I don't like things that look wrong. He paused. What you've brought me fills 3 gaps that I didn't have the documentation to close. He looked at Elias directly. How long have you known about the Ferris connection? Since last night. And you came straight here. We came straight here. Sue was quiet for a moment. What do you want? I want Grant Calder arrested before he can use the next 48 hours to clean up what's left. Elias leaned forward slightly. I want my CFO protected. She's currently at her sister's house, and someone tried to access her building last night. I want the hospital clerk protected, and I want this done through your parallel inquiry, not through anything Ferris has touched. You don't get to tell me how to run my office. I'm not telling you. I'm asking. He held Sue's gaze. You've been building this for 6 months with a gap you couldn't close. Now you can close it. What you do with that is your call. Another silence. Sue looked at the documents again. I'm going to need 4 hours, he said. There are people I need to move without Ferris knowing they're moving. There are warrants that need to go through a specific channel. He paused. You two need to stay somewhere I know about and not contact anyone connected to this case. No one. Not Marcus Del Rey, not your CFO, not your attorneys. 4 hours, Elias said, maybe 5. He looked at Vivian. She gave a small nod. We'll wait, Elias said. Sue pointed at the couch against the wall of his office. Wait here. He picked up his phone and turned toward the window. Don't touch anything on my desk. They waited. The 4 hours became 5. The 5 became 6. Vivian sat on the couch and ate the granola bar that Sue's assistant had brought without being asked and drank a bottle of water and shifted positions every 20 minutes because the couch was narrow and the baby was not interested in cooperating. Elias sat beside her and looked at his phone, which he had not contacted anyone on, and felt each hour pass with the specific weight of hours spent waiting for other people to determine your fate. At 2:17 in the afternoon, Sue came back into his office, and he wasn't alone. There were 2 other people with him, a woman Elias didn't recognize, and a man he did, barely, from a charity function 2 years ago. Federal agents, the kind who didn't wear their function on their clothes but wore it in how they stood. We have warrants, Sue said, for Grant Calder and 4 executives connected to ClearPath and 2 of the Shell subsidiaries. He looked at Elias. There's a complication. What? Calder left his office an hour ago. His assistant told our contact he was going to your building. Mercer Holdings. He paused. Your CFO is there. She came in this morning. She said she wanted to get ahead of the quarterly close before the disruption. She didn't know we were moving today. Elias was already standing. If he's going there because he knows, Vivian started. He knows, Elias said. He figured out we were in Sue's office. Or someone in this building told him not Sue, but someone in the building saw us come in. He looked at Sue. How fast can you get people to my building? They're already moving. Sue held up one hand. You are not going there. Diane Cho is there. Our people are 12 minutes out. What floor is he on? Sue looked at him steadily. I'm telling you to stay here, and I'm asking you what floor he's on. The 2 agents exchanged a look. Sue's jaw tightened. His last known location was the lobby, the woman agent said. 7 minutes ago. Elias was already at the door. "Mercer, send your people," he said without turning around. "I'll be there when they arrive." He heard Vivian say his name behind him, once, clearly, and he stopped with his hand on the doorframe. He turned back. She was standing, one hand on the arm of the couch, watching him with the dry, clear eyes she'd been watching him with since the kitchen. "Don't do something stupid," she said. "We didn't come this far for you to do something stupid." "I know. He wants you there. If he's going to your building, he wants you in his space on his terms." "I know that too." She looked at him for a moment. "Then why are you going?" "'Cause Diane Cho doesn't know what's coming." He held her gaze. "And because 15 years." He said it simply, not as justification, just as the truth of what it was. 15 years of something that had looked like partnership and been something else, and the part of him that needed to look Grant Calder in the face when it ended was not rational, but it was real. Vivian looked at him for 3 more seconds. "Come back," she said. He went. The drive to Mercer Holdings was 11 minutes. He ran 2 lights that he shouldn't have run. The building came up on his right, and he pulled into the parking structure at a controlled speed, took the elevator to the lobby, badged through the security desk with a nod to the guard he'd known for 6 years, and went up. The office was operating at its normal Tuesday afternoon pace. People at desks, phones ringing, the ordinary machinery of the place he'd built, running on its own momentum, not yet knowing that the ground under it had been moving for months. He went to the 32nd floor, executive level. Diane Cho's office was at the end of the hall, glass-fronted, and he could see through the glass from 20 feet away that she was inside and she was not alone. Grant was sitting across from her desk. He was sitting the way Ozzy sat, relaxed, ankles crossed, like he'd dropped by to chat. He was talking, and Diane was listening with her hands flat on the desk in front of her, and from the hallway Elias couldn't hear the words, but he could read the posture. Grant was not asking her something. He was telling her something. And Diane's face had the particular quality of someone who was very carefully not showing what they were feeling. Elias pushed open the glass door. Grant turned. And there it was, the thing Elias had been watching for, without knowing he was watching for it, through 2 weeks of dinners and phone calls and careful performances of concern. For 1/2 second, before Grant could construct the expression he needed, his face showed something that was not surprise and not anger. It was calculation, raw and immediate, the faces of a man running numbers. Then the performance came back up, and he smiled. "Elias." He stood. "I was just talking to Diane about the quarter minutes." "Stop," Elias said. The word came out flat and without heat, which was more effective than if he'd shouted it. Grant stopped. Elias looked at Diane. "Are you all right?" Her eyes met his briefly. "Yes. You should go to the conference room down the hall and stay there. There are people coming up in the next few minutes, federal agents. You should be with them when they arrive." Diane looked at Grant. Then she looked at Elias. Something passed between them, not words, just the compressed understanding of 2 people who had been carrying separate pieces of the same terrible knowledge, and were only now standing in the same room. She picked up her bag and walked out. Grant watched her go. When the door closed, his posture changed, something dropped away, the particular looseness of a man who was done performing. "How long have you known?" he said. "Long enough." That's not an answer. 2 weeks ago, I started pulling the transaction records. Elias walked further into the office and stopped 6 feet from where Grant was standing. 4 months ago, my wife found the correspondence files you left insufficiently buried in a shared company drive. He paused. Last night, I found out about Joel Ferris. Grant was very still. That surprises you, Elias said. That's the one that surprises you. Ferris was careful. Not careful enough. Elias looked at the man who had sat across from him for 15 years. He was trying to find something in Grant's face, some residue of the person he'd thought he knew, some layer beneath the construction. He wasn't finding it. How long were you planning this? Grant tilted his head slightly, like the question was interesting to him. The succession clause was already in the estate structure when you set it up. You built the vulnerability yourself, Elias. I just figured out how to use it. He paused. 4 years ago, give or take. 4 years ago, the year Elias married Vivian. Grant watched him absorb that. You brought someone in, he said. Someone who could produce an heir. And the estate structure became a different kind of asset. He said it with the same mild precision he used to talk about acquisition targets. I didn't engineer your marriage. I just looked at what it created and saw an opportunity. My daughter, Elias said. You're talking about my daughter, like she's a line item. Something crossed Grant's face. Not guilt. Elias wasn't looking for guilt and wasn't going to find it. Something colder. The child would have been fine. Provided for. The legal process would have taken time, but the outcome would have been. The outcome would have been that you controlled my company through a fraudulent claim against my infant daughter. His voice didn't rise. He would not let it rise. You altered my wife's medical records. You spent 8 months feeding Diane's case to a compromised contact so you could track what we had against you. You sent people to find Vivian in the middle of winter while she was 8 months pregnant. Grant said nothing. You want to tell me the child would have been fine. A beat. This doesn't have to end badly for you, Grant said. You're making a calculation right now about what comes next, and I'd encourage you to think about it carefully. The inquiry at the DA's office has been moved to a parallel track that Ferris hasn't touched. Elias watched Grant's face. There are warrants, Grant. They were signed 2 hours ago. The people who are coming up to this floor right now are not here for quarterly review. Grant looked at the door. There's nowhere to go, Elias said. I'm not saying that to be dramatic. I'm saying it because you are a precise man, and you should have the precise information. He paused. It's over. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Grant was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window behind Diane's desk, the city laid out beyond it, the November gray, the lake invisible in the haze. He looked at it with an expression that Elias couldn't read and didn't try to. Then Grant turned back and said, You would have lost the company without me. In the first 3 years. You know that, maybe. There was no maybe. The Hendricks deal would have collapsed and taken 18 months of runway with it. I held that together. He said it without heat, like he was establishing a record. I built as much of this as you did, and then you decided that wasn't enough. Grant said nothing. Why, Elias said. After all of it. Why, a long pause. Something moved in Grant's face. Not remorse. Not quite. But something human enough to be worth naming. Because you get to put your name on the building, he said. Because it was always going to be your name. No matter what I did, no matter how many deals I held together, or capital calls I managed, or problems I made go away, it was always going to be Mercer Holdings. Elias Mercer. He looked at him directly. I stopped being willing to be invisible. The elevator down the hall opened. Elias heard the doors, heard the footsteps, heard Sue's voice giving a quiet instruction to someone. Grant heard it too. He looked at the door. He looked at Elias. His jaw worked once, briefly, and then it stopped, and the precision came back, and his face went to something that was not quite calm, but was controlled, which was the closest Grant Calder was probably going to get. I want my attorneys, he said. They'll be called. Elias stepped back from the center of the room, clearing the path to the door. I'm not stopping anything. The federal agents came in. 2 of them, and Sue behind them. And Sue looked at Elias with an expression that was not approval, but was something adjacent to professional respect, which from Patrick Sue was substantial. Grant Calder was read his rights in the office of the CFO he'd come to intimidate, standing next to the desk of the company he'd spent 4 years trying to take. He listened to the rights with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the window, and when they asked him to come with them, he went without a word. Elias watched him go. He stood in the empty office for a moment after they left. The room was very quiet. Diane's things were on her desk, a coffee cup, a notepad, a framed photo of 2 kids he didn't recognize but thought might be her nieces. The ordinary evidence of a person who worked in a place, who had shown up every day for 6 years and done her job with more integrity than he'd known she was protecting. He'd need to tell her that. He was aware that there were a large number of things he needed to tell people, and that the list was going to require more of him than he was currently equipped to give. He was going to be unequipped for a while. That was just the honest shape of it. He pulled out his phone. He called Vivian. She picked up on the second ring. He could hear in the breath before she spoke that she had been waiting with the particular quality of someone who'd used up their capacity for emergency and was running on something more stripped down and basic. It's done, he said. Silence for a moment. Diane's okay, he said. Grant is in custody. Sue's people are moving on the other warrants. He paused. Are you okay? I've been sitting on a federal prosecutor's couch for 6 hours. Her voice was rough at the edges. I need to lie down somewhere that isn't a couch. I'm coming back, Elias. She paused. The baby's been moving for the last hour. Constantly, he went still. Is that should we? It's not contractions. It's just she made a sound that was almost a laugh. She's restless. She's been waiting, too. He stood in Diane's office and felt something that had been locked down and load-bearing in his chest shift, fractionally, toward something that wasn't an emergency. I'm coming back right now, he said. Don't move. I'm not going anywhere. A pause. I'm genuinely not going anywhere this time. He walked back through the office floor, past the desks and the phones and the ordinary machinery, and took the elevator down and got back in his car. He drove back toward the federal building with both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the gray Chicago sky, and the thought that kept returning to him, the one he couldn't organize into anything more articulate than its raw form that he had spent his entire adult life building things he could put his name on, and the thing that mattered was not now in a building with his name on it. It was sitting on a federal prosecutor's couch, tired and unromantic and 8 months pregnant, and it had been worth protecting all along. And he had let someone else do that protecting, while he was too deep inside his own empire to see what was happening to his actual life. He stopped at a light on Michigan Avenue. A woman crossed in front of his car with a stroller and a coffee cup and the expression of someone who had been up since 5 and had made peace with it. He watched her cross. He thought about the nursery with the gray walls, the dresser with the folded onesies. The light changed. He drove. His phone buzzed on the seat beside him. Marcus, remaining warrants executed. ClearPath office sealed. 2 executives taken into custody at O'Hare trying to board. Hospital clerk has been contacted and is cooperating. She's at the field office now with all 3 copy sets. A pause in the messages, then, it's done, Elias. Go be with your wife. He read the texts at another light. Then he put the phone face down on the seat and focused on driving. He was 7 minutes from the federal building when his phone rang again. Not Marcus this time. The number was Sue's direct line. He answered. There's a problem, Sue said without preamble. Elias's hands tightened on the wheel. What kind? The financial records from ClearPath. The servers were set to a remote wipe protocol. When our people executed the warrant and went in, someone had already triggered it remotely. A pause. We lost approximately 40% of the transaction records from the ClearPath end. The records from your company's side are intact, and what Diane Show had is intact, but the ClearPath originals. How much does it affect the case? It weakens it. Not fatally. What we have from your side and from Cho is still substantial, and the medical records alteration documentation is solid. But Grant's attorneys are going to argue that the missing ClearPath records exculpate him on specific transaction count. Sue paused. We expected this as a possibility. We have enough. But the case just became more complex. More complex how? Longer, more contested. His attorneys will push for exclusion on any count where the ClearPath records were the primary evidence. A pause. He may not go down on everything. Elias sat at another light. He thought about Grant in the room saying, "You would have lost the company without me." He thought about the precision of it, the particular kind of precision that had spent 15 years watching him, and the remote wipe protocol that someone had triggered the moment the warrant hit one last move, managed from somewhere by someone who'd built the contingency in advance. Even now, even in custody, what do you need from me, Elias said. The hospital clerk's documentation is the cleanest evidence we have that's completely outside anything that's been touched or wiped. The medical records alteration is airtight. It doesn't depend on the ClearPath servers. And it's the part that's hardest to defend. Sue paused. That's what puts him away on the counts that matter most. The fraud is complex and contestable. Using a medical record system to manufacture a fraudulent legal claim against an infant that's harder to walk back. Elias looked at the federal building coming up on his right. Then build it on that, he said. I intend to. A pause. Get back here. I need both of you for formal statements before end of day. And your wife should see a doctor. I'm pulling in now. He parked and walked back into the building and took the elevator to 14 and pushed open the door to Sue's office and found Vivian exactly where he'd left her on the narrow couch, legs up, one hand on her belly, looking at him when he came in with those dry, clear eyes. She looked at his face and read whatever was on it with the efficiency of someone who'd been reading him for 4 years. Not perfect, she said no. But enough, how not perfect? He sat down beside her. The ClearPath servers were remotely wiped, We lose some transaction counts. The case is still viable. Sue says the medical records piece is the strongest element. That's where it lands. She was quiet for a moment. He planned for it, she said, even in custody. Yes. He had someone trigger the wipe. Yes. She looked at the ceiling. He's going to fight every count, probably. This isn't going to be clean. No. He looked at her. It was never going to be clean. It was always going to be long and contested and expensive, and he stopped. We do the statements today. Sue builds what he can build. Grant's attorneys push back on what they can push back on. And we spend the next however many months dealing with the parts that don't resolve cleanly. He paused. But he's in custody. The scheme is exposed. The warrant is real and the case is real, and what he was planning to do to the baby that's documented, and it's not going away. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. Then she shifted on the couch and put her head on his shoulder, which was not a thing she'd done since before the night in the kitchen, and he didn't move and didn't say anything. He just sat with the weight of her against him, and outside Sue's window, the November light was going gray toward evening, and somewhere downstairs in a federal holding area, Grant Calder was talking to attorneys. He thought, this is not over. He thought, nothing this size is ever just over. He thought, but we're on the other side of it now, and she's here, and the baby is here, and the rest is just work. Vivian lifted her head after a moment. I need to use the bathroom, she said. And I need food that isn't a granola bar. I'll find something. She stood with his help. She let him help. This time, a small concession, he noted, without commenting on, and walked toward the door Sue's assistant had showed her earlier. At the door, she stopped and turned. Elias. She looked at him with an expression he could almost read. Grant said about the building. Your name on it. She paused. He wasn't entirely wrong about what he built. He held her gaze. I know, he said. That's not... She stopped, reconsidered. I'm not defending him. I'm saying the thing that made this possible was the thing that also made you not see it. The same thing. She looked at the floor briefly, then back up. And we're going to have to talk about that. Not now. But I know, he said again. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she went through the door. He sat in the office alone and looked at the whiteboard covered in names and arrows that Sue hadn't quite erased, and he thought about what came next. The statements, the case, the months of contested proceedings. The company restructured and audited and turned inside out by investigators who would find things beyond what they'd already found, because investigations always did. The executives who'd known and said nothing, the ones who hadn't known and would have to decide what they owed and to whom. Diane Cho, who would either be a hero or a liability, depending on how the Ferris situation resolved, and probably both. The hospital clerk with her 3 sets of copies in a field office somewhere in this building, talking to agents with the steady voice of someone who'd decided weeks ago that she was going to do the right thing and had made peace with the cost. Vivian's hand on her belly in the dark, the baby that had been used as an instrument before she was born. The building with his name on it, which he had built and which had been the mechanism of all of this and which he was going to have to decide what to do with. His phone buzzed. Marcus, one more thing. The second vehicle in Kellerton, the one that had eyes on the house. We traced the registration. It's not ClearPath. It's a private contractor. The name on the contract traces back to an individual account, not a corporate one. Someone was running a separate operation, not through Grant's network. Elias read the message. He read it again. Not through Grant's network. He typed back, whose account? The 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again, then working on it. Give me an hour. He put the phone down. He sat in Patrick Sue's office in the late November afternoon, and the case that he'd thought was collapsing toward resolution opened up at its edge, and the hour ahead of him felt suddenly like the longest hour he'd had yet. Marcus's hour became 90 minutes. Elias spent them in a small conference room, 2 doors down from Sue's office, giving his formal statement to a junior agent named Carver, who had the focused, slightly humorless quality of someone who understood that the work mattered and kept his head down and did it. Carver asked clean questions. Elias answered them in order, without editorializing, building the sequence the way you'd build a case structure foundation first, then the load-bearing elements, then the details that would hold up under pressure. Vivian was in the adjacent room, giving her own statement. He could hear her voice through the wall occasionally, not the words, just the rhythm of it, steady, precise, unhurried. The voice of someone who had been rehearsing this moment in some form for 4 months and was finally in the room where it counted. At 5:47, Marcus called. Elias stepped into the hallway and answered. The second vehicle, Marcus said. The one in Kellerton that wasn't running through Grant's network. Yeah, it traces back to a private contractor named Dov Rice. Operates out of Cincinnati, does corporate investigation work, the kind of work that exists in the gray space between legal and the other thing. A pause. The account that hired him is registered to an LLC called Haverford Consulting. One-person operation, no website, no public presence. Another pause. Haverford Consulting's registered agent is a woman named Patricia Hale. Elias stood in the federal building hallway. Hale, he said. Vivian's mother, Marcus said. Patricia Hale, 61, currently residing in Scottsdale. She hired Rice privately 6 weeks ago. The contract was to locate and monitor Vivian's whereabouts. He paused. Not to intervene, not to report to Grant, just to monitor. Elias said nothing. The mother knew Vivian had disappeared, Marcus said. She hired someone to find her, separately, privately, without telling anyone. She wasn't connected to Grant's operation. Her motivation appears to have been entirely personal. A pause. But Rice's vehicle in Kellerton, that wasn't Grant's network that found her. That was her own mother's contractor. Elias stood with this. The second vehicle, the one that had spooked Carol enough to send Vivian running through the woods to the Harmon barn. The vehicle that had pushed the timeline, that had forced Vivian to move to Kellerton, that had narrowed the geography enough that Grant's people could run their property search and close in. Vivian's mother had hired someone to find her daughter, and that contractor's presence had inadvertently done what Grant's people had been trying to do for weeks, driven Vivian into a smaller space, a more traceable location, a place where the search radius became manageable. Does Vivian know? Elias said. Not yet, that's your call. He stood in the hallway for a moment longer. He thought about Patricia Hale in Scottsdale, a woman he'd met 8 times in 4 years, who sent birthday cards and called every Sunday, and had cried at their wedding with the specific intensity of a woman who had spent years worrying about her daughter and was relieved to see her safe. He thought about what it felt like to watch your child disappear and have no channel for the fear except money, and a private contractor, and a monitoring operation you believed was protective. It was not the right choice. It had made things worse. But the math of why she'd done it was not complicated. She needs to know, Elias said, but not today. Today has enough. Agreed, Marcus said. Rice has been contacted and his monitoring contract terminated. He has no remaining obligation to report to Patricia Hale or anyone else. He's cooperating. A pause, Elias. I think that's the last thread. Elias leaned against the hallway wall, the last thread. He turned it over, looking for the place it connected to something else, some extension he hadn't traced yet. He didn't find one. Thank you, he said to Marcus. For all of it. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Go be with your family, he said, and ended the call. Elias put the phone in his pocket and walked back into the conference room and finished his statement. At 6:30, Sue came into the hallway, where Elias and Vivian were standing with paper cups of bad coffee, and told them they were done for the day. The statements were complete. The warrants had been executed. Grant Calder was processed and held pending arraignment. The 4 ClearPath executives were in custody. Joel Ferris had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal inquiry that Sue described with the clipped precision of a man who had been waiting to use those specific words about a specific person for some time. The case is going to take the better part of a year, Sue said. Maybe longer. You'll both be called as witnesses. Don't discuss specifics with anyone outside your legal counsel. He looked at Vivian. You need to see a doctor tonight if possible. I know, she said. He looked at Elias. You need to get ahead of the press. By morning, this is going to be public. The ClearPath warrants will leak. They always do. You should have a statement ready. I'll handle it. Sue looked at them both for a moment. You did the right thing coming here, he said. It was not effusive. It was just true, stated plainly, the way Sue appeared to state most things. You had the parallel inquiry, Elias said. We just helped you close it. Yes, Sue said. You did. He went back into his office. They took the elevator down in silence. In the lobby, Vivian stopped walking and stood for a moment with her eyes closed. Just stood in the middle of the federal building lobby with its hard floors and bad lighting, and breathed. Elias stood beside her and waited. After a moment, she opened her eyes. "I need real food," she said, "and I need to sit somewhere that isn't a federal building." "Okay, and I need you to tell me what Marcus said." "The call in the hallway." He looked at her. "Tomorrow." She looked back at him. "That bad?" "Not bad, just a lot." "And you've had enough for today." She considered this. "Okay," she said finally, which cost her something. He could tell she was not a woman who deferred easily, who accepted the rationing of information with grace. But she was tired in a way that went past argument, and she let it go. They went to a diner 3 blocks from the federal building. It was not the kind of place Elias Mercer usually ate. It had vinyl booths and a laminated menu and coffee that came in a mug with a small chip on the handle. They sat across from each other and ordered, and when the food came, Vivian ate with the focused efficiency of someone who had been running on granola bars and adrenaline for too long, and Elias watched her and ate his own food and let the silence be what it was. After a while she said, "What happens to the company?" "It gets audited. Thoroughly. There will be regulatory review of every transaction in the relevant period, probably going back further. Some executives will cooperate and some won't. There will be civil liability." He looked at his coffee. "It survives, but it comes out different. What do you want it to come out as?" He thought about this. "Smaller," he said, "more accountable. Some of what I was doing was possible because I built a structure that was too large to see all the way through. I was running on trust where I should have been running on verification." He paused. "I want to be the kind of person who knows what's actually happening inside what he built." She looked at him. "That's different from what you were." "Yes." She turned her coffee mug in her hands. "Diane Cho. She stays. If she'll stay. She's the most honest person in the building, it turns out. She was doing the right thing alone for 8 months because she didn't know if she could trust you." "I know. That's a thing you should tell her. Not as a compliment. As an acknowledgement of what it cost her." "I know," he said again. The diner was quiet around them. A couple in the booth across the room were sharing a piece of pie and arguing mildly about something neither of them seemed particularly invested in. A man at the counter was reading a newspaper with the focused contentment of someone with nowhere to be. "My mother," Vivian said. He went still. She was watching his face. "You said tomorrow," she said, "but your face just did a thing." He looked at her for a moment. Then he told her, not everything, not every operational detail, but the core of it, her mother, the contractor, Kellerton, the second vehicle, what it had inadvertently set in motion. Vivian was very still while he talked. She held her coffee mug with both hands and looked at the table. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "She didn't tell me she was scared," Vivian said finally. "She knew I'd gone. I called her from a payphone in the first week, told her I was okay, told her not to look. She said she wouldn't." She paused. She lied. "She was your mother, and you were 8 months pregnant and missing. I know why she did it." Her voice was flat, not cold, just stripped of the energy required for anything more than the truth. "I'm not angry at her. She stopped. "I'm just tired of being in a situation where the people who love me do things that make my life harder while trying to make it better." She said it without looking at him. But they both understood it wasn't only about her mother. He didn't deflect. He didn't qualify. "I'm sorry," he said. "For the funds I wasn't paying attention. For the distance that made it possible for you to be carrying all of that without me noticing." She looked up. "Not for the big thing," he said. "I can't apologize for Grant I didn't know, and not knowing was its own failure, but it wasn't malicious. But the distance." He held her gaze. "I was here in the technical sense and not in any useful sense, and you were dealing with something massive alone because I wasn't available. In the way that mattered." He paused. "I know what I owe that. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Vivian looked at him for a long time. The diner hummed around them, the ordinary warm sounds of a place that fed people without requiring anything from them. "I should have told you," she said, "when I first found the records. I should have told you and trusted you to handle it, even when I wasn't sure you could." She pressed her thumb along the edge of the coffee mug. "I made myself the only person holding it because I was afraid, and that was—" She stopped. "It was my version of the same thing, not being present. Not letting you in." He said nothing. "Let it sit." "We're both bad at the same thing," she said. "Yeah, that's either a foundation or a disaster. Probably both, at different times." She looked at him, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile. but was the first thing in 4 months that was in that neighborhood. "I want to call my mother tonight," she said. "Okay. It's not going to be a good call. No, but it needs to happen." "Yes." She finished her coffee. He paid the check. They walked out into the November night, and the cold hit immediately, and Vivian pulled her coat tighter, and he walked close enough that their arms touched, and neither of them moved away. They went to a hotel that night. Not the house felt like a different conversation, one they weren't ready for. A hotel room downtown, nothing extravagant. A place to sleep that was neutral ground. Vivian called her mother, and he gave her space for it, sat in the bathroom with the door mostly closed, and listened to the murmur of her voice without the words. The call lasted 22 minutes. When it was over, she stood in the bathroom doorway with the phone in her hand. She cried. Vivian said, "I'd expect that." She said she thought the contractor was being careful, that he was just watching, that no one would know. She looked at the phone. She didn't understand that watching can move things. She knows now. Vivian set the phone on the dresser. "She wants to come when the baby's born." I told her yes. She paused. "Is that? Of course it's yes." She looked at him. "Okay." She sat on the edge of the bed with the careful lowering motion that 8 months of pregnancy had made habitual, and she pressed both hands against her belly and looked at the window. He sat beside her. "What happens next week?" she said. "The press statement. The board meeting. I need to meet with the regulatory attorneys. There's going to be a period where the company is under a level of scrutiny that is going to be genuinely unpleasant to operate inside of." He paused. "And at some point, fairly soon, you're going to have a baby." She made a sound. "The baby is planning to come whether or not the regulatory situation is resolved." That's been my read. She's been extremely active tonight. She's heard a lot. Vivian looked at her belly. "She has no idea," she said softly. "What her existence caused. What it set off." A pause. "What people tried to do with her before she was even born. She doesn't need to know. Not for a long time. She'll know eventually. When she's old enough. She'll find out that before she was born, a man tried to use her as a legal instrument to steal her father's company." Vivian's voice was very steady. "I want to be the one who tells her. I want her to hear it from me in the right way, when she's ready. Then that's how it happens." She turned to look at him. "You don't get to decide that by yourself. I know. I'm agreeing with you." She studied him for a moment. "You're doing that thing where you sound very reasonable." "I am very reasonable. You drove 3 hours in the middle of the night and ran 2 red lights on Michigan Avenue. Those were judgment calls." She looked at him for another moment, and then she lay back on the hotel beds, sideways still dressed, and stared at the ceiling with her hands on her belly. He lay back beside her. The ceiling was plain and white and had nothing interesting about it. After a while she said, "I want a different house." "Okay, not different neighborhood necessarily, just not that house. It doesn't feel like ours anymore. It feels like the house where everything was already going wrong while we were pretending it wasn't. Whatever you want. I'm serious. I don't want to go back there." "I know you're serious." He looked at the ceiling. "I'll call someone this week. We can stay in a hotel until we find something. Or I can rent a place short-term while we look." "With a yard," she said. "Okay, not a lawn, a yard. Something that's actually for people to be in, not just to look at." "I know the difference. I wasn't sure you did." He turned his head to look at her profile. "Vivian." "What?" "I know the difference between a lawn and a yard." She turned her head and looked at him, and the thing happened in her face that he'd been waiting for, since the kitchen, not the not-quite smile from the diner, something more open than that. Something that's lived in the same neighborhood as the woman he'd married, and the woman who'd walked out the door, and all the versions in between. It came and went quickly, but he saw it. "Yard," she said. "With a yard." "With a yard," he said. She turned back to the ceiling. He turned back to the ceiling. Outside the hotel window, the city moved at its ordinary pace, indifferent and continuous the way cities are. She fell asleep before he did. He lay beside her and listened to her breathe, and did not sleep for a long time, because there were things still settling the case, the company, the months ahead that were going to be hard in ways he could anticipate and ways he couldn't. He ran through the list of things that needed to happen in the next 72 hours, and then he made himself stop running through the list. Because the list would be there tomorrow, and the moment he was in right now was not going to be available again in exactly this form. He thought about his father. He did this rarely by choice, but tonight it arrived without asking. His father, who had been a drunk with grandiose dreams and a talent for disappearing when things got hard, who had left Elias at 12 with the lesson that men built things and then abandoned them, and that the building was separate from the person, and that you could put your name on something and still have nothing underneath it. He had spent his adult life trying to disprove that lesson. He had put his name on a building and filled it with a company and called that proof. He lay in a hotel room next to his sleeping wife and understood, in a way that had not previously been available to him, that the building had nothing to do with it. The lesson his father had actually taught him was smaller and more specific than he'd let himself understand, that you could be present or absent, that presence was a choice made continuously, and that a man who was absent from the people who needed him had already abandoned them regardless of where he was standing. He had been absent. He was going to be less absent. That was not a dramatic transformation. It was just a choice, made now, that would have to be made again tomorrow and the day after. He turned onto his side. Vivian was facing away from him, her hands curled near her face the way they were when she slept, and her breathing was slow, and even in the way that meant she was genuinely under, not just resting. He looked at the back of her head, the familiar, specific shape of her, and felt something that was not quite gratitude, because gratitude implied she'd done it for him. She hadn't done it for him. She'd done it because it needed to be done, and she was the person who saw it, and she was not built for looking away from things that needed doing. That was going to be hard to live with sometimes. The precision of her, the particular honesty of someone who had already proven they could carry enormous without telling you. It was going to produce friction. It was going to require him to be better in ways that were uncomfortable. He was going to do it anyway. He put his hand lightly on her shoulder, not waking her. Just there, and he closed his eyes. He slept. 3 weeks and 4 days later, Vivian Hale gave birth to a daughter at Northwestern Memorial Hospital at 6:18 in the morning. The labor was 14 hours and not uncomplicated, and not what anyone would describe as smooth. And at 3 points, Elias stood in the room feeling the full inadequacy of a person who can neither fix the thing that is happening nor leave. And he held her hand when she'd let him, and stayed out of the way when she needed him to, and he talked to her in the low, contiguous way. She'd asked him to not encouragement, not coaching, just his voice. Something to focus on that wasn't the pain. At 6:18, the doctor placed the baby on Vivian's chest. Elias stood at the side of the bed and looked at his daughter. She was red and unhappy about the transition, and had a remarkable amount of hair, and she was, immediately and without negotiation, the realest thing he had ever been in a room with. Vivian was looking at the baby with the complete attention of someone for whom the rest of the room had temporarily ceased to exist. She had been through 14 hours of something Elias could not have managed, and she looked wrecked and clear-eyed simultaneously, the way people look when they've come through something enormous and the adrenaline hasn't dropped yet. "Hey," she said to the baby. Her voice was rough and quiet. "Hey, I know. The baby, who did not know and had no framework for any of this, moved his hands in the agitated way of a person who has just been relocated without consent. Elias put his hand on Vivian's shoulder. She leaned into it fractionally. After a while, she looked up at him. "She's really here," she said. "She's really here. I was afraid." She stopped. "I know. I kept thinking something would." She stopped again. There were things in her face that she wasn't saying, 4 months of fear that had no single clean outlet and was coming out around the edges now that the immediate thing was over. He didn't press. He just kept his hand on her shoulder. "She's here," he said. "Both of you are here." The baby made a sound of concentrated disapproval. Vivian made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, the specific compound emotion of someone who has been holding something very heavy for very long and has just imperfectly set it down. They named her Nora. It was not a name they'd discussed before. They'd had a short list that neither of them had felt strongly about. And then in the recovery room, 2 hours after, Vivian had said Nora quietly, like she was trying it out. And Elias had said yes without thinking about it, and that had been that. Patricia Hale arrived from Scottsdale 2 days later. The conversation between her and Vivian had happened in the hospital room on the second day, with Elias in the hallway, where he was not needed and knew it. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. He heard Vivian's voice go sharp once and then go quiet. When Patricia came out, she looked like a woman who had been fairly and specifically told what her actions had cost, which was what she had needed. She looked at Elias in the hallway with the expression of someone who doesn't know what reception to expect. "She's okay," he said. "Go back in." Patricia went back in. He walked to the window at the end of the hallway and looked at the city and gave them the time they needed. In the weeks after, the case moved through its early stages with the grinding procedural pace of large federal matters. Grant's attorneys were as capable as his resources allowed, which was very capable. They challenged the admissibility of specific transaction records, argued procedural violations in the warrant execution, and filed 3 separate motions in the first month. Sue's office countered each one, using the medical records alteration as the fixed central element of the case, the piece that was fully documented, legally clean, and resistant to the arguments Grant's team was making elsewhere. Joel Ferris resigned from the DA's office in the 3rd week. He did not face charges. The internal inquiry found that his relationship with the lobbyist, while deeply inappropriate, had not reached the legal threshold for obstruction. Elias thought this was wrong. Sue, when asked, said the threshold was what it was, and the case they were actually building was more important than a tangential prosecution that would complicate the main proceeding. Elias accepted this because he had to, and because Sue was right, even though it sat in him the way things sit when they're unjust, and also unchangeable. Diane Cho stayed. He had the conversation with her in her office, a week after everything had settled enough to have it. He told her what it had cost her to do the right thing alone for 8 months. He did not dress it up or make it into a tribute. He said, "You spent 8 months doing the right thing in a building where you didn't know if the person at the top was safe to trust. That was a failure of the environment I created, and I know it. And I'm telling you that because you're owed the acknowledgement." Diane looked at him across her desk. She was not a woman easily moved by gestures, which was one of the things that made her trustworthy. "What's the practical outcome?" she said. "You run an independent oversight function that reports directly to the full board, not to my office. Budget under your direct control. You can escalate anything to regulatory authorities without requiring internal approval." He paused. "And we're restructuring the transaction approval process for anything above a certain threshold to require dual authorization with documentation." Diane looked at him steadily. "That's going to slow some things down." "Yes, you're okay with that. I'm going to have to be okay with a lot of things that slow things down," he said. "Turns out speed was one of the ways I stopped seeing what was happening." She nodded once. "Precisely." "Okay," she said. "Okay, you'll stay," or "okay generally." "Both," she said, and picked up her pen, which was her version of the conversation being over. He established the foundation 6 months after Grant's arrest. Its formal name was the Hale Mercer Medical Integrity Foundation, and it funded research and advocacy around medical record security, specifically around the vulnerability of prenatal and genetic records to unauthorized access and manipulation. He hired a director with a background in medical ethics and a board that included Vivian, the hospital clerk whose name turned out to be Janet Rourke, and a patient advocacy attorney Vivian had found through the specialist in St. Louis. Janet Rourke, when asked at the Foundation's first board meeting what she wanted her role to be, said she wanted to make sure that whatever happened to her couldn't happen to someone without the backup copies. She said it plainly, the way she'd said everything in the months Elias had known her, without drama or expectation of applause. He thought she was one of the braver people he'd encountered. The house they found was in a neighborhood 20 minutes from downtown, smaller than the one they'd left, with a yard that was genuinely a yard, an oak tree in the back that had been there 50 years longer than the house, a flagstone path that needed repointing, a side gate that stuck. Vivian walked through it on a Thursday afternoon, with Nora in a carrier against her chest, moving from room to room, with the assessing attention of someone who was measuring it against something she'd been building in her head for a while. She stopped in the kitchen, which had old tile, and a window above the sink that faced the yard. She stood there for a moment. "This one," she said. They moved in on a Saturday in early April, with help from people they actually knew rather than hired staff, which was chaotic and inefficient, and resulted in 3 boxes being labeled wrong and a lamp being broken, and Elias and Vivian's college friend Doreen directing traffic in the driveway with the authority of someone who had been waiting. Her whole life for this particular logistical role. Nora slept through most of it in her car seat, placed in the middle of the kitchen floor where everyone could see her, which was where she was when she woke up and looked at the ceiling of her first real house with the focused curiosity of someone encountering a new phenomenon and finding it acceptable. In the evenings that came after the ordinary evenings of a family in a house with an oak tree in the yard and a gate that stuck, Elias would sometimes stand in the kitchen while Vivian was somewhere else in the house and look at the window above the sink and feel the distance between the life he'd been living and this one. Not nostalgic for the previous version, not mourning it, just aware of the distance, the way you're aware of how far you've walked when you stop and look back at where you started. He had lost the version of himself that had his name on the building and called that proof of something. He was not sure yet what the new version was called. He suspected it would take longer to name than he had time for on any given evening, which was probably fine. The naming was less important than the doing, and the doing was in front of him in specific and daily forms in the foundation board meetings, and the restructured company, and the federal case that was still grinding through its procedural life, but also in the flagstone path that needed repointing, and the gate that stuck, and the daughter who had no framework for any of it, and was here anyway. On a Saturday morning in late May, Vivian carried Nora into the backyard and stood under the oak tree in the thin, warm light. Elias stood at the kitchen window and watched them. Vivian was talking to the baby. He couldn't hear the words through the glass, just the cadence of it, the particular rhythm of a person narrating the world to someone who is still building the categories to put it in. She looked tired in the way that young parents look tired, which is continuous and unromantic, and has nothing to do with failure. She looked like a woman standing in her own yard in the May light, talking to her daughter, which was not a dramatic thing, and was not a triumphant thing, but was the thing that was actually there when you stripped everything else away. He went outside. He stood beside her under the tree, and she leaned against him with the ease of someone who had decided imperfectly, and with full knowledge of what it cost to lean. Nora looked up at the oak leaves moving against the sky with the concentrated focus of someone encountering something vast for the first time. She likes the tree, Vivian said. Smart kid. She was watching it for 10 minutes before you came out. She's thorough. Vivian looked up at the tree herself. We should get the gate looked at this week. I'll call someone. You keep saying that. This time I'll actually call. She looked at him sideways. I'll believe it when the gate opens without a fight. The oak tree moved above them, the leaves catching the morning light, making the specific sound that oak trees make in May, when the year is new enough that everything is still in the process of becoming. Nora watched it all with her full attention, which was the only kind of attention she had, the unapologetic, complete attention of a person who has not yet learned to be anywhere other than exactly where she is. Elias held his daughter and stood with his wife under the tree in the ordinary morning and let the silence be exactly what it was. Not the silence of an empty kitchen at midnight with a suitcase by the door, but the other kind. The kind that didn't need to be filled.